Here I am in Mavensmate, my coding editor of choice. You can code wherever you prefer, however. First thing I'll do is create a new trigger on the lead object. I'll call it dedupe lead. This trigger needs to run whenever a lead is created, so it'll be an insert trigger. I don't foresee us using any of the system fields of the lead, such as the lead ID or the lead created date, so I'll keep this as a before trigger. The before trigger is usually a pretty safe bet, so when in doubt, just use before. We can always come back and change it later. Next, we have our customary trigger loop. Indented inside this loop is where our logic will go. To help keep my eyes on the goal, I'll write in some comments on what my main steps are. First, I need to search for matching contacts to determine if this lead is a dupe. If I find a match, I need to assign this lead to the data quality queue and add the duplicate contact IDs in the description. Now I'm ready to translate these comments into code. First, our SOQL query. I'm going to store the results of our SOQL query in a list of contacts. The reason I'm using a list and not using the single record shortcut is because it's very possible that there are multiple contact dupes found. One of the objectives of this trigger is to put all the IDs of the contacts found into the lead's description. So I know our query will need to at least include the contact's ID. I don't think we'll be using any other contact fields for now, so I'll just query the ID field until further notice. If we later try to use data from contacts that we haven't queried here first, we'd get an error. Now for our SOQL where clause. I want to only pull contacts that this lead is duping, contacts with the exact same email address. So I'll add a where clause that says the contact email needs to be the same as the lead email. And for this, I'll need a bind variable for the lead email address. So I added a colon before using the myLead variable, so SOQL knows that I'm using an Apex variable. Super powerful. By the way, Apex triggers by default run in system context, aka God mode. This means that your trigger will always run with full permissions, regardless of who's using it. So if one of your users creates a lead that's a dupe of a contact he doesn't have access to, your trigger will still find the dupe contact and run normally. In the scope of this trigger and most other triggers, that's a good thing. We'll continue this permissions conversation in a future course. Now's a good time to add a debug statement in case I come across errors later. I'll have my debug statement tell me exactly how many contacts were found. Okay, that part is done. Now for the second half of this trigger. What to do when matches are found. I only want to execute the rest of the logic if there are contact matches, whether it's one match or multiple matches. So I'll write an if statement that checks to see if our contact list is not empty using an exclamation point and the isEmpty dot notation method. The exclamation point flips your Boolean. True becomes false and false becomes true. So our if statement will run if our list is not empty. You can do the same thing by checking to see if the size of this list is greater than 0. Both methods work. Now I'm going to take this opportunity to reorganize my code. Nothing bothers me more than improper indentation. It makes code so much harder to read. This is something I really commonly see newer developers overlook, so make sure your indentation is perfect. Since we're going to be writing code that executes when our if clause is true, all the code inside its brackets needs to be indented in. First thing we need to do is set our lead owner to our data quality queue. The crude way of doing this would be to just hardcode the queue ID here. The problem with hardcoding is that your ID is not guaranteed to always be the same. For example, our data quality queue could have a different ID in our sandbox than in our production org. Or maybe someone remakes the data quality queue one day and thus it gets a new ID assigned to it. The best way to guard yourself against these kind of changes is to query the ID using SOQL. A little bit of Googling told me that queues are part of an S object called group. So I'll run a SOQL query on the group object. I know for sure I only want one group, so I'll use the shortcut and save our result directly in a group S object, not a list. To make sure I have the right group, I'll filter it down to queues with the exact developer name we called out earlier, data_quality. Developer names are always unique, so I don't need to worry about multiple matches here. But I'm paranoid and I like to sleep at night, so I add a limit 1 at the end. Excellent. Now that we have our queue, I'll assign our lead owner to it. Don't forget that you set relationship fields like owner using IDs. So I populate the lead owner ID to my queue ID, not the variable itself. Now I want to include the matching contact IDs in the lead description. As with most things in code, there are many right ways to do this. Always aim for the simplest solution possible, but know that when you're learning, you're bound to overcomplicate things sometimes. Since we might have multiple matching contacts, I can tell we're going to need to loop through our matching contact list. The overall plan is to create a string variable and include all our info in it, then set our lead description to it. I'll begin with the intro, duplicate contacts found. The /n creates a line break in our variable. Next, I'll loop through each of our duplicate contacts and add them to our string. The += notation here is a common shortcut that tells Apex to add a string at the end of the existing string. It would actually be really nice if we included other info in our dupe contacts here, so I'll add in a few more fields. I believe if you can make something better than what's required, you should go for it. Sometimes this will get you in trouble though, so make sure you know what you're doing. It's really hard to read code when it takes up a lot of horizontal space, and it's common for some companies to mandate a maximum width for each line of code. Because of this, I separate out my code into multiple lines. These 4 lines still represent one code statement. I'm just adding extra white space between sections. Apex is fine with this. Finally, I'm going to set our lead description to our string variable. There might be existing information in the description field that's important, so I'll add that back in after our dupe info. Excellent. Now we have hopefully a working trigger. I like to take this moment to clean it up and make it a little more efficient. One thing to know about SOQL queries in your triggers is that they're relatively resource intensive. You generally want to include as few SOQL queries as possible in your triggers. We only have 2 queries in our trigger, but remember, they're inside the trigger loop, so each one could actually run many times. Out of these 2 SOQL queries, the one on the group object stands out as one we can easily optimize. No matter how many times this trigger runs and on what leads, this query always returns the same record. So instead of running this query for each lead, I'm going to pull it out of our loop and put it in the beginning of our trigger. Then inside our loop, we can still reference the data quality group variable. Remember, all child blocks of code have access to all parent variables, so it's fair game to reference the data quality group variable later on in our code. Looking at the other SOQL query in our trigger, this one would be more difficult to optimize. Because of the bind variable in it, the results of this query would be different each time it's run. So we can't just run it once and reference it later like we did with the other SOQL query. Well, not with our current Apex knowledge at least. That's an advanced technique I'll save for the next course. I think this trigger is good to go now. Let me save it and see what errors come up. I'm trying to have as little editing as possible in this demo portion because I also want you to learn how to resolve issues as they come up. But there are no errors here, so today's my lucky day. I'm probably one of the most paranoid coders out there, and even when I'm copying other people's working code, I still somehow manage to have errors. So don't feel bad if you're getting errors too. There's no shame in forgetting semicolons. Let's get ready to give this trigger a run in our org.